Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Imagine losing half the people you have ever known. Not in a war that lasted decades, not in a famine that crept slowly across seasons, but in a single terrifying year, sometimes in a single month, sometimes in a single street in a single afternoon. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and before it finished its work, somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire continent's population was gone. Tonight, we follow that story from its origins in the steppes of Central Asia to the silent, half-empty cities of medieval Europe, and all the way to the world it left behind, a world so shaken that it would never, in any meaningful sense, be the same again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The world before the storm, Europe and Asia on the eve of catastrophe. To understand what the Black Death destroyed, you first have to understand what it found. And what it found in the middle of the 14th century was a world that believed itself to be, if not exactly thriving, then at least holding together. A world with its hierarchies intact, its rhythms established, its God firmly in his heaven and its kings, however flawed, sitting on their thrones. A world that had, in its own medieval way, figured things out. At least that is what most people living in it believed. History, as it so often does, had other plans. Let us begin in Europe, because that is where our story will spend most of its time. The Europe of the early 1400s, in the decades just before the plague arrived, was a continent structured around a set of interlocking systems that had taken centuries to build. At the very top sat the church, not just as a spiritual institution, though it was certainly that, but as the organizing principle of existence itself. The Catholic Church in 14th century Europe was more than a collection of priests and bishops and cathedrals. It was the framework through which ordinary people understood their lives, their deaths, their suffering, and their hope. It provided the calendar that told farmers when to plant and when to rest. It provided the hospitals, such as they were, that cared for the sick. It provided the schools. It performed the rituals that marked every significant moment of a human life from birth to burial. To question the church was not merely heresy. It was, in a very practical sense, stepping outside the known world entirely. Beneath the church, European society was organized along feudal lines, though the feudal system by the 1400s was already showing its age. At its simplest, feudalism was a pyramid. At the top sat kings, who owned, at least in theory, all the land within their kingdoms. Below them were the great lords, the dukes and counts and barons, who held their lands as grants from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. Below them were the lesser lords and knights, and at the very bottom, comprising the vast majority of the population, were the peasants. Serfs in many regions, technically bound to the land they farmed, unable to leave without their lord's permission, paying rent in labour or in kind, living in villages of thatched wooden houses clustered around a church, a mill, and the local lord's manor house. Peasant life in this period was not, it must be said, a particularly glamorous affair. Most people ate a diet of bread, pottage, which was essentially a thick soup of whatever vegetables were available, and occasional small amounts of meat when they could get it. They worked from dawn to dusk, particularly in the growing season. They paid taxes to their lord and tithes to the church. They dealt with the unpredictable cruelties of medieval weather. A late frost could destroy a crop. Too much rain could rot a harvest in the field. And the 14th century had already dealt Europe some punishing blows in this regard before the plague ever arrived. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is worth mentioning here because it set the stage for everything that followed. Beginning with catastrophic rainfall across northern Europe in 1315, the famine lasted 7 years and killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population in some regions. Livestock died, crops failed repeatedly, people ate cats, dogs, leather, and in some documented cases each other. The famine weakened populations across northern Europe, leaving immune systems compromised, bodies thinner, communities less resilient. When the plague arrived a generation later, it found people who were, in many ways, already worn down by decades of hardship. And yet, and this is important to hold in mind, Europe in the 1340s was also a place of genuine vitality. The cities, though small by modern standards, were alive with commerce, with craft guilds, with the noise and smell and colour of medieval urban life. Florence in Italy was home to perhaps 90,000 people and was one of the great financial centres of the Western world. Its banking families, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Medici, were just beginning their rise, extending credit across Europe, funding wars and cathedrals and royal ambitions from London to Constantinople. Venice was a maritime empire unto itself, its merchant ships threading through the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea, its merchants legendary for their shrewdness and their reach. Paris was home to perhaps 200,000 souls, the largest city north of the Alps, a teeming, chaotic, magnificent place of scholars and criminals, monks and market women, all jostling together in its narrow, muddy streets. These cities were connected to each other and to the wider world by trade routes that carried not just goods, but ideas, languages, fashions, and, as would become catastrophically apparent, diseases. The overland routes that connected Europe to Central Asia and China, the waterways of the Mediterranean that linked Italy and France and Spain to the ports of the Byzantine Empire and the Black Sea, these were the arteries of medieval commerce. Silks and spices and porcelain moved westward. Silver and wool and furs moved eastward. Merchants travelled them in caravans and convoys, conducting the business of the known world with remarkable sophistication, given the technology available to them. And then there was the wider world beyond Europe, because the Black Death did not begin in Europe. It was a global catastrophe long before it became a European one, and to understand its European chapter, you have to pull back and look at the whole map. In the mid-14th century, much of Asia was under the control of the Mongol Empire, or rather its successor states, since the great unified empire of Genghis Khan had by this point fragmented into several competing Khanans. The Pax Mongolica, the relative peace enforced across the Mongol domains, had made long-distance trade easier than it had ever been before. Merchants could travel the Silk Road from China to the Black Sea with a reasonable expectation of safety. Information, people and goods moved across Eurasia at speeds that would not be matched again for centuries. But the Pax Mongolica also created something else, a network of roads and trade routes and caravanserais that could carry a disease across an entire continent in a matter of months. And somewhere in the heartland of that network, something terrible was already stirring. Something that had lived in the rodent populations of Central Asia for thousands of years, biding its time, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to make its move. The plague was coming, and the world it was coming for had no idea. There is something deeply poignant about this, actually. Reading the letters and chronicles and account books from the early 1340s, you encounter people who are worried about the right things. War, taxes, harvest yields, the price of grain, the political ambitions of neighbouring kings. They are worried about everything except the thing that is actually coming for them. They are going about their lives, planning for futures they will not have, building institutions that will be cut off at the root, raising children who will die before their parents. The ordinary human business of existing, completely unaware of what is already moving through the rat populations of the Asian steppe, already beginning its slow, inexorable journey west. In China, there were already signs. Chronicles from the early 1340s record unusual mortalities in various provinces, epidemics that wiped out large numbers of people in a short time. Kyrgyzstan has provided some of the most striking archaeological evidence, with grave markers from the years 1348 and 1349 recording an unusual spike in deaths, some of the inscriptions using words that historians have associated with plague. The disease was already active, already spreading, already killing. It just had not reached Europe yet. In the Byzantine Empire, the great medieval successor state to Rome, centred in Constantinople, trade continued and scholarship survived, and the emperor sat on his golden throne in the palace district overlooking the Bosporus. Merchants from Genoa and Venice maintained trading colonies on the shores of the Black Sea, buying furs and grain and slaves, selling them cloth and spices, conducting the energetic commerce that linked Europe to the wealth of the East. These colonies, particularly the Genoese settlement at Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, would soon become the stage for a moment that changed the trajectory of European history. But we will get to that. For now, in the years just before 1347, the world is going about its business. Farmers are farming, merchants are trading, monks are copying manuscripts, kings are fighting each other. The English and the French are locked in what will eventually become known as the 100 Years' War. The Pope is sitting not in Rome but in Avignon in southern France, a situation that strikes many devout Catholics as deeply troubling. The Ottoman Turks are beginning their expansion westward. The Italian city-states are producing the first stirrings of what will eventually be called the Renaissance. It is a world recognizable to anyone who knows European history. Complicated, hierarchical, deeply religious, sometimes brutal, capable of great beauty and great cruelty in equal measure. A world that has survived famines and wars and heresies and has always, eventually, found its way back to some version of stability. It will not find its way back from what is coming. Not for a very long time, and some of what it was before will be gone forever. The world before the Black Death is worth understanding not just as historical context, but as a portrait of ordinary human life in all its complexity, all its assumption of continuity, all its faith that tomorrow will resemble today in the ways that matter. That faith is about to be shattered in a way that no one living in the 1340s could have anticipated or prepared for, and the shattering will be so complete, so total, so overwhelming in its scale, that it will leave marks on European civilization that are still visible today, nearly 700 years later. We begin then in the East, where it all started, in the animal populations of Central Asia, in the ecological conditions that made everything possible, in the slow and terrible emergence of one of the most efficient killers the natural world has ever produced, origins in the East, where the plague was born. Every catastrophe has a birthplace. The Black Deaths was not a city or a battlefield or even a particular human community. It was a landscape, a vast and largely empty landscape of steppe and semi-arid grasslands stretching across Central Asia, from the region around modern-day Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan all the way east into China and Mongolia. This landscape was, and remains, home to enormous populations of burrowing rodents. Marmots, ground squirrels, gerbils, voles, tens of millions of them, living in their underground colonies, going about the small business of rodent existence. And living among them, hitching rides on their bodies, feeding on their blood, were fleas. Specifically, and this will become very important, a species of flea called Xenocilla chiopes, the rat flea, and several related species. These fleas were not by themselves dangerous. They were simply fleas doing what fleas do, jumping from host to host, feeding, reproducing. But some of them carried something. Some of them, in their digestive systems, harboured a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis is, in the bluntest possible terms, a masterpiece of biological engineering, if you're willing to use the word masterpiece for something so comprehensively terrible. It is a gram-negative bacterium, meaning it has a particular kind of cell wall structure, one that helps it evade certain aspects of the immune system. It has evolved over thousands of years of coexisting with rodent populations, a remarkable set of tools for surviving and spreading, and on very rare occasions when conditions aligned in just the right, or rather just the wrong, way, it spilled over from its rodent reservoir into human populations. This spillover is called a zoonotic event, an infection jumping from animal hosts to humans, and it has happened many times throughout history in various parts of the world. Most of the time, when plague spills over into humans, it burns through a local community, kills some people, and then burns out because the human population is too sparse or too dispersed for it to keep spreading. Most of the time, it stays local. Most of the time. The question that historians and epidemiologists have wrestled with for decades is, what was different about the middle of the 14th century? What changed? What made this particular outbreak not a local tragedy but a global catastrophe? The honest answer is that we do not know with complete certainty, but there are some very compelling theories. The first has to do with climate. The early 1400s was a period of climate disruption across much of the Northern Hemisphere, part of what climatologists call the transition toward the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling that gradually transformed weather patterns across Eurasia. Climate disruption affects rodent populations. It affects the vegetation they depend on. It forces migrations. It changes population densities. And when rodent populations are stressed, when they are moving, when they are crowding together in new configurations, the conditions for disease transmission change. Yersinia pestis, which had lived in relative equilibrium with its rodent host for millennia, may have been jolted out of that equilibrium by environmental change. The second factor has to do with the Mongol Empire. The Pax Mongolica that we mentioned in the previous chapter had done something remarkable. It had opened Central Asia. Merchants, armies, diplomatic missions, animals, all moving along the Silk Road, all potentially carrying fleas, all potentially serving as bridges between the rodent reservoirs of the steppe and human populations farther east and west. The same infrastructure that moved silk and spices could also move a bacterium. And in the 1340s, it appears to have done exactly that. The earliest reliable evidence of plague in the region comes from Central Asia in the late 1330s and early 1340s. Archaeological evidence from burial sites near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, discovered by Russian scholars in the 19th century and more recently subject to ancient DNA analysis, shows an unusual spike in deaths in 1346 and 1348, with some inscriptions explicitly referring to pestilence. These communities lived along the Silk Road. They were part of the great trading network that connected east to west, and among them, Yersinia pestis was doing what it does. From Central Asia, the plague moved. It moved westward with trade caravans. It moved through the Mongol armies that were operating in the region. It moved, in other words, along the very arteries of human connection that the medieval world depended upon. Each caravanserai, each trading post, each town along the Silk Road was a potential stepping stone. The bacterium was, in a grim sense, hitching a ride on civilization itself. By the 1340s, the plague had reached the western edges of the Mongol domains, the region around the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea that was under the control of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that dominated the western steppe. This was a region of intense commercial activity. Genoese and Venetian merchants had established trading colonies along the northern shore of the Black Sea, buying goods brought overland from China and Central Asia and shipping them back to Europe. These colonies were wealthy, strategically vital, and as events were about to demonstrate, catastrophically exposed. The plague's advance was not, of course, announced. There were no warning signals sent ahead. No heralds galloped into towns crying out that death was on the road. The disease moved silently, carried in flea-infested bales of goods, in the clothing and bodies of infected travellers, in the rats that inevitably accompanied any large caravan or ship. People got sick. They died. More people got sick. More people died. And somewhere along the Silk Road, the realization must have begun to dawn on surviving communities that this was not an ordinary sickness, that something unprecedented was happening. Chinese chronicles from this period record significant mortality events in the early 1340s. The province of Hubei, to pick one example, is recorded as having lost a large fraction of its population. The exact figures are disputed, as they always are with medieval mortality statistics, but the general picture is consistent. Something was killing people across a vast geographic area, and it was killing them quickly. The disease was already well established across much of Central and East Asia before it reached the Mediterranean world. The Mongol armies that operated in the western steppe, the soldiers and commanders of the Golden Horde, were encountering it. They were dying of it in significant numbers, and in 1345 and 1346, the Golden Horde under Khan Janibeg was engaged in a military campaign that would inadvertently become one of the most consequential moments in the history of the Black Death. He was laying siege to a city on the Crimean Peninsula, a city called Kaffa, and the plague was with his armies. Now, before we get to Kaffa, which deserves its own chapter, let us pause for a moment on the bacterium itself, because understanding what Yersinia pestis actually does to a human body will make everything that follows more legible. The plague comes in three main forms, and we will cover this in more detail later, but briefly. Bubonic plague. The most common form is transmitted by flea bites. The bacterium enters the lymph nodes, which swell into painful lumps called buboes, sometimes the size of an egg or an apple, in the groin, armpits, or neck. The infection spreads through the bloodstream. Without treatment, death occurs in 30 to 60% of cases, typically within 3 to 7 days. Septicemic plague occurs when the bacterium enters the bloodstream directly, either from a flea bite or as a complication of bubonic plague. The blood itself becomes infected. Death rates approach 100% without modern treatment, and death can occur within hours of the first symptoms. Pneumonic plague is the airborne form, transmitted by breathing in droplets expelled by infected individuals. It infects the lungs. It is almost always fatal without treatment, and critically, it does not require a flea or a rat, just a person breathing near another person. This is the form that allowed the plague to spread explosively in dense urban environments. All three forms were present in the Black Death, and that combination, the flea-borne bubonic form for transmission from rats and fleas to humans, the pneumonic form for person-to-person transmission in crowded cities, is what made this outbreak unlike anything the medieval world had seen. It was not just one disease, it was 3 diseases sharing a pathogen, each capable of killing on its own, together creating a catastrophe that overwhelmed every system of response available to 14th century society. In Central Asia in the 1340s, All of this was already in motion. The bacterium was spreading, communities were dying, armies were falling sick, and the great trading routes that connected this region to the Mediterranean world were already carrying the seeds of catastrophe westward, toward a world that had absolutely no idea what was coming. There is a particular irony in the fact that the very success of the Mongol Empire, its construction of the most extensive overland trade network the medieval world had ever seen, is part of what made the Black Death possible. The same openness, the same connectivity, the same ease of movement that had made the Pax Mongolica one of the remarkable administrative achievements of the medieval world also made it a perfect vector for a pandemic. Connection has always been a double-edged thing. The same roads that carry goods carry germs, the same ships that carry silk carry rats. The medieval world was about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way imaginable, the Siege of Kaffa, when war became a weapon of disease. There is a moment in the history of the Black Death that reads, even at a distance of nearly 7 centuries, like something from a nightmare. It happened on the Crimean Peninsula, on the northern shore of the Black Sea, in the years 1345 and 1346. And it may well be the hinge point on which the entire catastrophe turned, the moment when the plague moved from a regional disaster in the steppes of Central Asia to a weapon aimed, however inadvertently, directly at the heart of European civilization. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony. The Genoese, those endlessly enterprising merchants from the northwestern coast of Italy, had established it in the late 13th century as a base for their Black Sea trade. It was a remarkable settlement, fortified, prosperous, and strategically positioned at the meeting point between the overland routes from Central Asia and the sea routes to the Mediterranean. Goods of every description passed through its warehouses, and its population, a mixture of Genoese merchants and administrators, local Crimean Tatars, and traders of various other nationalities, made it one of the more cosmopolitan places in the medieval world. The Mongol Golden Horde under Khan Janibeg had long had a complicated relationship with the Genoese colony. Trade was profitable for both parties, but political tensions were always simmering. In 1343, a brawl between Italians and local Muslims provided the pretext Janibeg needed to move against the colony. His armies besieged Kaffa, demanding its surrender. The Genoese, well provisioned and well fortified, refused and held on. The siege went on for some time, and then, sometime in 1345 or 1346, the plague arrived in the Mongol camp. This was not unusual in the context of sieges. Disease was a standard feature of medieval military operations. But this was not a standard disease. The soldiers were dying in large numbers, swiftly. The characteristic black spots and swollen glands that would become the defining visual markers of the Black Death were appearing throughout the camp. The siege was becoming untenable. What happened next is described by Gabriele de Mussi, a Genoese notary whose account, though he may not have been present personally, is our primary source for this event. Janibeg's commanders, de Mussis tells us, ordered the bodies of those who had died of plague to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the walls of Kaffa into the city. The intent was practical, if also deeply grim. They wanted to use the dead bodies as a form of biological weapon, infecting the besieged population and forcing a surrender. Now, historians debate the extent to which this actually worked as a biological weapon in the technical sense. Modern understanding of plague transmission suggests that the bodies themselves, cooling and stiffening after death, were probably not the most efficient vectors of transmission. The fleas would have left the bodies as they cooled, but the fleas could have landed on the rats within the city, and those rats could have infected the city's population, or, more likely given what we know about pneumonic plague, infected Mongol soldiers had already been in close enough contact with defenders during various skirmishes to transmit the pneumonic form directly. Whatever the precise mechanism, the outcome is not in dispute. The plague entered Kaffa. It began killing the Genoese traders and their servants and their families, and the Genoese, facing catastrophe both from the siege and from the disease raging through their city, made the decision that would change the world. They got on their ships and they sailed for home. You have to feel a moment of sympathy for them, even as you recognize the catastrophic consequences of what they did. These were people watching their city die around them, people who had lost friends and colleagues and family members to a disease they did not understand and could not treat. They were terrified, and terrified people do what terrified people have always done. They run. The ships that left Kaffa in the spring and summer of 1347 carried merchandise, certainly, They carried the personal possessions of those lucky enough to secure passage. They carried people desperate to reach home, desperate to escape the death that surrounded them. And they carried something else. They carried the plague in the goods in the hold, in the rats that were as much a part of any medieval ship as the rigging, in the bodies of sailors who were already sick when they boarded and would be dead before the voyage ended. The ships made their way through the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. De Mussis describes them arriving at various ports along the way: Pera and Constantinople, Messina, Genoa itself. And at each stop the sailors who came ashore were already showing signs of the disease, or were dying, or were already dead at their oars. At several ports the ships were driven off when the extent of the horror aboard became clear. But by then it was too late. The flea-infested cargo had already been touched. The sick sailors had already walked the docks. The rats had already gone ashore. The plague had boarded the ships at Kaffa, and the ships had carried it to the heart of the medieval world. The siege of Kaffa had failed as a military operation. As a delivery mechanism for the most devastating pandemic in European history, it was tragically, catastrophically successful. There is something almost unbearable about the particularity of this moment, the fact that it was a siege, the fact that it was a decision, however understandable, to use plague victims as weapons, the fact that a military operation in a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, a place most medieval Europeans had never heard of, set in motion a chain of events that would kill a third of Europe. History is full of these moments of terrible contingency, where a specific decision, a specific coincidence, a specific act of human desperation cascades into consequences so enormous that they dwarf anything their authors could have imagined. Janibeg's commanders almost certainly did not know what they were doing, in the sense of understanding the disease they were using. They knew the bodies of the plague dead seemed to cause sickness in those who came near them. They were using that observation as a weapon. They could not have known they were setting off a chain reaction that would reshape the entire continent their trade goods were destined for. And the Genoese sailors who boarded those ships, sick and terrified and desperate for home, could not have known they were carrying death with them. They were just trying to survive. It is one of the great tragedies of the Black Death that the people who accidentally unleashed it on Europe were not villains in any meaningful sense. They were just people, doing what people do, caught in circumstances beyond their comprehension, making decisions that made sense to them in the moment, with consequences that no one could have foreseen. The ship sailed west. The Mediterranean waited, and Europe, in all its medieval complexity and vitality and profound unpreparedness, had no idea what was heading toward its ports. Sicily and the ships of death, the plague arrives in Europe. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese ships docked at the port of Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily. This was not, in itself, unusual. Messina was a busy port, a regular stop on the Mediterranean trade routes, accustomed to the arrival of merchant vessels from the Black Sea. Ships came and went constantly. The dock workers and port officials who went to receive these particular ships were doing what they always did. What they found stopped them cold. Most of the sailors on board were already dead. Those who were still alive were in a condition so horrifying that the chroniclers who recorded it struggled to find adequate language. They were covered in black boils, some the size of a lentil, some the size of an apple, oozing blood and pus. Their limbs were darkening. Their breath was laboured and foul-smelling. Their skin was discolouring. Some were coughing blood. And among those who could still speak there was delirium, wild-talking incoherence that suggested the infection had reached their brains. The Messina port authorities, to their credit, moved quickly. They ordered the ships out of the harbour immediately. The sailors were not to be allowed ashore. The ships were to leave. But here is the thing about that decision, taken with perfectly reasonable intentions, that makes a medieval epidemiologist want to scream into the void. It was too late. Not by hours, almost certainly by days. The ships had been in the harbour. People had been aboard them. Cargo had been moved. Rats had come ashore. Fleas had jumped. The plague was already in Messina. Within days, people in the city began to fall ill. The symptoms were unmistakable and unforgettable. First came a general feeling of being unwell, fever, chills, headache. The kind of symptoms that, in a medieval person's experience, might mean any number of things. But very quickly, within hours or a day or two, came the defining marker of bubonic plague. The swelling. Painful, hard, hot lumps appearing in the lymph nodes, most often in the groin, the armpits, or the neck, depending on where the flea had bitten. These were the buboes that gave bubonic plague its name, and alongside the buboes, In the most severe cases came the blackening of the skin, caused by hemorrhages under the surface, the black spots that gave the Black Death its eventual name, and they died. Quickly, with a speed that medieval people had simply never witnessed in any disease they recognized. A person could be well in the morning, feverish by midday, covered in buboes by evening, and dead within the week, sometimes faster. The pneumonic form which attacked the lungs could kill in 2 or 3 days. The septicemic form, overwhelming the blood, could kill faster still. The reaction in Messina was panic. The chronicler Michel de Piazza, a Franciscan friar who recorded the events, describes the citizens of Messina fleeing to the countryside, carrying the plague with them without knowing it. He describes the city descending into a kind of ordered chaos, people refusing to have anything to do with the sick dying in their homes or in the streets, the dead piling up faster than the living could bury them. He describes the priests refusing to enter houses where plague victims lay, the doctors who examined patients contracting the disease and dying alongside them. The Messinese sent to nearby Catania for help. They asked the bishop to send the relics of St. Agatha, the city's patron saint, hoping that her intercession might stop the plague. The Catanians refused. They were afraid that even the messengers from Messina carried the disease. They were right to be afraid, as it turned out. Catania would have the plague within weeks regardless. The ships expelled from Messina's harbour sailed on. They made for other ports. They arrived at Catania, at Syracuse, at other Sicilian ports, at ports on the Italian mainland. Some were driven away, as Messina had tried to do. Some were allowed to dock, their condition either not yet apparent or ignored in the press of commercial business. And everywhere they went they left the plague behind them, a trail of invisible biological breadcrumbs leading from the Black Sea all the way to the doorstep of medieval European civilization. By the end of 1347, the plague was in Sicily. It was in Sardinia and Corsica. It was in the ports of Genoa and Marseille, on the Italian and French mainland. It was in Pisa. It was beginning its approach toward Florence, toward Venice, toward Rome. It had crossed the water from Asia to Europe, from the trading colonies of the Black Sea to the commercial heart of the Mediterranean world. The first chapter of the European catastrophe was already underway. Looking back at this with the knowledge of what happened next, there is an almost surreal quality to the speed of it. The ships arrived in October. By the end of the year, the plague was already established in multiple Mediterranean ports. By the following spring, it would be tearing through Italy. By the summer, it would be in France. By autumn, it would be in England. The speed was partly a function of the maritime trade routes, which moved goods and people and rats with remarkable efficiency. But it was also a function of the nature of the disease itself. Plague, particularly in its pneumonic form, does not wait patiently for the next ship. It moves through human bodies, through human communities, through the invisible networks of human contact, with a speed that no medieval society was equipped to track or understand. One of the things that strikes me most forcefully about the Messina story is how ordinary it begins. Ships arrive. Port officials go to meet them. This is what happens every day in every port in the Mediterranean world. There is nothing in the routine of October 1347 to suggest that this particular arrival is different from all the others. The catastrophe begins not with thunder and lightning, but with the entirely mundane arrival of a fleet of merchant vessels in a busy harbour. History's worst moments often do. They begin quietly, with ordinary people going about ordinary work, completely unaware that something has changed, that the world they knew when they woke up that morning is already, in some fundamental sense, not the world they will go to sleep in tonight. What was the Black Death? The biology of a killer. Let us take a moment to step back from the historical narrative and look directly at the thing itself, at Yersinia pestis, at what it actually does, and how it does it, and why it was so extraordinarily effective at overwhelming medieval bodies and medieval medicine alike. Because to understand the Black Death as a historical event, you need some grasp of the Black Death as a biological one. And I promise, even if biology is not your usual territory, this is worth understanding. Yersinia pestis is a bacterium. It is named after Alexandre Yersin, the French-Swiss bacteriologist who identified it in Hong Kong in 1894, during another significant plague outbreak. When Yersin isolated the bacterium, he established that it was indeed the cause of plague, and his identification opened the door to understanding the disease in ways that medieval doctors simply could not have managed. For the people of the 14th century, the disease was a mystery that could only be interpreted in terms of the conceptual frameworks available to them, which were, as we will see in a later chapter, almost entirely wrong. But the bacterium itself cared nothing for medieval cosmology. It was simply doing what evolution had equipped it to do. The primary reservoir of Yersinia pestis in nature is rodent populations, particularly the various species of burrowing rodents that inhabit the grasslands and steppes of Central Asia. Though it exists in rodent populations on other continents as well, the bacterium has coexisted with these rodent populations for long enough that many of them have developed a degree of resistance, though not complete immunity. The rodents can carry the bacterium in their systems without always dying of it. The fleas that live on them can pick it up when they feed on infected blood, and they carry it in their digestive systems. Here is where the biology gets particularly grim. When a flea feeds on an infected host, the Yersinia pestis bacteria in the flea's gut begin to multiply, eventually forming a blockage in the flea's proventriculus, the part of the digestive system that connects the stomach to the esophagus. This is called flea blockage. The flea becomes, in essence, a plugged biological syringe. When it attempts to feed again, it cannot swallow the blood it draws from the new host. Instead, it regurgitates infected material back into the bite wound. The bacterium enters the new host's bloodstream through the wound. The infection is established. The human body's response to Yersinia pestis entering the bloodstream is initially an attempt to contain the threat at the nearest lymph node. The lymph nodes are part of the immune system, filtering stations that trap pathogens and try to destroy them. When Yersinia pestis enters the lymph node, the immune system mounts a response. And here is one of the most remarkable and terrible things about this particular bacterium. It has evolved specific mechanisms to resist and subvert that immune response. It can survive inside the immune cells that are supposed to kill it, using them as shelter while it multiplies. It produces proteins that disable certain immune defenses. It is, in the most technically accurate sense, a biological arms race that evolution has spent thousands of years running, and Yersinia pestis is very, very good at it. As the bacteria multiply in the lymph node, the node swells enormously, filling with bacteria, dead immune cells, and inflammatory fluid. This is the bubo. The swelling is painful in the extreme. Contemporary accounts describe people screaming with the pain of the buboes. The lymph nodes closest to the site of the flea bite swell first, which is why the groin, the armpits, and the neck, where large lymph nodes are located, are the typical sites. The buboes can grow to the size of a chicken egg or larger. Some sources describe them reaching the size of an apple or even an orange in extreme cases. They are hot to the touch, hard, and in the later stages they may rupture, leaking blood and pus. Meanwhile, the bacteria are not staying neatly contained in the lymph nodes. They are entering the bloodstream, spreading through the body, attacking organs. The liver, the spleen, the kidneys, all can be compromised. The immune system is releasing massive amounts of inflammatory chemicals in its effort to fight the infection. And this systemic inflammatory response, called a cytokine storm in modern medical terminology, causes many of the symptoms: the fever, the extreme thirst, the confusion, the terrible pain. In some cases, the inflammation is so severe that it damages blood vessels, causing hemorrhages under the skin, which appear as the characteristic dark spots or patches that give the disease one of its names. In bubonic plague, untreated, the mortality rate is somewhere between 30 and 60%. Those who survive generally do so because their immune systems, for reasons that vary from individual to individual, manage to contain and eventually overcome the infection, often after the buboes rupture and drain. Those who do not survive typically die within 3 to 7 days of the first symptoms appearing. In the medieval period, with no effective treatment, mortality in some communities appears to have been significantly higher than the average, partly because of the secondary form of transmission. Because once the bacterium is in the bloodstream and begins affecting the lungs, as it does in a significant proportion of untreated bubonic plague cases, the victim begins to develop pneumonic complications. They cough. The coughs expel tiny droplets containing live Yersinia pestis. Anyone breathing in those droplets can develop primary pneumonic plague, which bypasses the lymph nodes entirely and attacks the lungs directly. Pneumonic plague is almost universally fatal without treatment, and it spreads through the air. In a crowded medieval city, the combination of bubonic and pneumonic transmission was devastating. The flea rat cycle spread the disease through the urban rat population and from rats to humans. The pneumonic form then spread it from human to human, through families crowded into small homes, through caregivers who attended the sick, through the priests who administered last rites, through the merchants who brought food to infected neighbourhoods. The disease did not respect social boundaries. It did not stop for curfews or prayers or herbal remedies or any of the other interventions that medieval medicine could offer. I should mention here that there has been considerable academic debate over the past several decades about whether the Black Death was in fact caused solely by Yersinia pestis, or whether other pathogens may have been involved. Some researchers have suggested that the speed of the Black Death's spread and its mortality rates seem inconsistent with what we know about bubonic plague from more recent outbreaks. Some have proposed that anthrax or hemorrhagic fever viruses or other pathogens may have played a role. This debate is genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint, and I want to acknowledge it, because honest history involves acknowledging what we do not know as well as what we do. However, the weight of evidence, including increasingly sophisticated ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains from confirmed Black Death graves across Europe, strongly supports Yersinia pestis as the primary or sole pathogen. Researchers have extracted Yersinia pestis DNA from teeth and bones of plague victims in England, France, Germany, and other European countries, confirming its presence beyond reasonable doubt. The debate has been largely, if not entirely, resolved in favour of the traditional identification. The Black Death was plague, Yersinia pestis. 1 bacterium, 3 forms of infection, 1 catastrophe. There is one more thing worth saying about the biology before we move on, something that bears directly on why the Black Death was so much more lethal in the 14th century than plague outbreaks in the modern era. Modern bubonic plague, diagnosed and treated with antibiotics, has a mortality rate of around 11%. Pneumonic plague, caught early and treated aggressively, can be survived. The difference between the medieval and modern experiences of plague is almost entirely attributable to the availability of antibiotics. Streptomycin, gentamicin, tetracycline. These drugs can kill Yersinia pestis before it overwhelms the body's defences. Without them, the 14th century had nothing. Bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayer, lancing the buboes, which sometimes helped because it released pressure and drained infectious material, but which was as likely to spread infection as to cure it. Nothing that medieval medicine had in its arsenal was capable of stopping Yersinia pestis once it established itself. The medieval world was fighting a biological war with no weapons, and the biological enemy it was fighting was, by any objective measure, extraordinary at what it did. Italy on fire, Florence, Venice, and the first catastrophe, Italy, was where the Black Death introduced itself to Europe in its full, terrible scale. And Italy in 1348 was precisely the worst possible place for a devastating epidemic to arrive. Not because Italians were somehow more vulnerable than their European neighbours, but because of what Italy was in the middle of the 14th century. It was the most densely urbanised region in Europe. It was the most commercially connected region in Europe. Its cities were, by medieval standards, enormous, crowded, humming with the constant movement of people and goods that trade generates. And all of that density, all of that connectedness, all of that busy commerce was perfect fuel for the plague. Let us begin in Florence, because Florence is where we have the most extraordinary first-hand account of what it was like to live through the Black Death. That account comes from Giovanni Boccaccio, writer, scholar, and one of the great literary figures of the 14th century, best known for the Decameron, a collection of 100 tales supposedly told by a group of young Florentines who have fled to a villa in the hills outside the city to escape the plague. The framing device of the Decameron requires Boccaccio to describe, in its introduction, what they are fleeing, and what he describes is one of the most harrowing first-hand accounts of the Black Death that we possess. Boccaccio begins his account in the spring of 1348. Florence, he tells us, was one of the finest cities in Europe, a city of perhaps 90,000 people, full of beautiful buildings, prosperous merchants, brilliant artists, and learned men. And then the plague arrived. He describes the initial symptoms with clinical precision: the swellings in the groin and armpit and neck, the dark patches on the skin, the terrible speed of death. He notes, with what seems like genuine bewilderment, that not only did the sick die, but the healthy who came near them also died. That handling the clothing or possessions of the sick seemed to transmit the disease. He records the case of 2 pigs who rooted through a pile of rags, belonging to a man who had just died of plague and were dead within a short time. He is observing, with a non-scientist's eye, the reality of flea-borne transmission, though he has no conceptual framework for understanding what he is seeing. What Boccaccio describes next is the social fabric of Florence tearing apart, He describes how the disease caused people to abandon all normal bonds of human society. Citizens avoided each other. Relatives left sick, relatives to die alone. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. Servants refused to attend their masters. Doctors, he notes, either refused to see patients or saw them and died alongside them. The sick were left in their homes, attended by no one, or they were turned out into the streets to die in public view. The dead lay in houses until the smell alerted neighbours, or they were dragged out and left in the streets until the carts came round to collect them. The burial situation became grotesque. Florence had cemeteries, of course, but the cemeteries could not absorb the dead fast enough. New pits were dug, vast trenches, into which bodies were stacked in layers, with a thin covering of earth between each layer, and then another layer of bodies and another, until the pit was full. Boccaccio uses a phrase that has stayed with me since I first read it. He says the dead were treated like merchandise, loaded and unloaded without ceremony, without dignity, without the rituals that medieval Christianity had developed over centuries to ease the transition from life to death. The dead were just matter to be disposed of. The living were too busy trying not to join them. The mortality in Florence during the spring and summer of 1348 was catastrophic. Estimates vary, and the documentary record for this period is inevitably patchy, but the scholarly consensus suggests that Florence lost somewhere between half and 2/3 of its population in the initial outbreak. In a city of perhaps 90,000 people, that means somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 dead, in a matter of months. Think about that for a moment, because the number is so large that it risks becoming abstract. 60,000 people. In a city that had taken centuries to build, to grow, to develop its remarkable culture and its extraordinary financial institutions and its tradition of civic life. Gone in months. The streets that had been full of noise and commerce were silent. The great banking houses whose fortunes had been built on decades of careful financial management and international connections were suddenly staffed by the dead or the traumatized survivors of the dead. The wool workshops, the silk traders, the money changers, all reduced to a fraction of their former capacity. Their workers dead, their managers dead, their supply chains disrupted by death all the way back through the trade routes to the east. Venice was not spared. Venice, if anything, was hit even harder in some respects, given the intensity of its commercial connections to the plague's point of origin. The Venetian Republic kept remarkably good records, and those records show mortality on a scale consistent with Florence. Venice also took some of the most important early public health measures of the plague era, which we will discuss in more detail when we get to the chapter on medicine. But the measures, however thoughtful for their time, could not stop what had already started. Genoa was devastated, with particular cruelty given that it was Genoese merchants who had brought the plague home from Caffa. There is no record of Genoese contemporaries recognizing this connection, or at least no record of them acknowledging it. Perhaps they did not make it. Perhaps the thought was too terrible. Perhaps they simply could not know, given their complete ignorance of how the disease actually spread. Pisa fell, Siena fell, Rome itself fell. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura of Siena wrote about burying 5 of his children with his own hands, unable to find anyone to help him. He wrote that no one wept for the dead because everyone expected to die themselves, that the situation was so terrible that it could not even be described as a calamity, because that word was insufficient. He wrote, and I find this phrase genuinely haunting, I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. It was not the end of the world, of course, though it must have felt like it. But it was the end of a world, a particular configuration of society and economy and culture that had taken centuries to develop, and that would take generations to rebuild in any form, and that would never, in crucial ways, be rebuilt the same way at all. The great banking houses suffered not just from the direct mortality of their staff and partners, but from the cascading economic effects. The Bardi and Peruzzi, Florence's 2 most powerful banking families, had already been weakened by Edward III of England's default on enormous loans before the plague arrived. The plague finished what Edward had started. Their collapse sent economic shockwaves across Europe. Credit dried up, trade shrank. The interlocking financial systems that had underpinned European commerce for decades wobbled and cracked. But Italy was just the beginning. The plague had come ashore in Europe's most connected, most urbanized region. And from there, it moved, in every direction, with terrible purpose, northward through France, westward through Spain, across the water to England, eastward through the Holy Roman Empire, northward through Scandinavia, eastward into Poland and Russia. Europe was about to learn what Italy had already learned. The hard way, the march across Europe. From the Mediterranean to the north, if you were to watch the Black Death spread across a map of Europe, animated across the years 1347 to 1353, it would look less like a military advance, orderly and directional, and more like a fire, spreading outward from multiple points simultaneously, following the paths of least resistance, which in this case meant roads and rivers and sea lanes, jumping ahead of itself along trade routes, occasionally appearing somewhere unexpected, and then burning backward to fill in the gaps. It was not orderly, it was not rational, it was biological. We have already traced it into Italy, where it established itself in the closing months of 1347 and through 1348. Now let us follow it north and west. France. The plague entered France, the most populous kingdom in medieval Europe, through the port of Marseille on the Mediterranean coast, probably in December of 1347 or January of 1348. Marseille was a major port, deeply connected to the Italian trade networks that had brought the disease westward. From Marseille it moved up the Rhône Valley, one of the great arteries of medieval French commerce. The Rhône connected the Mediterranean coast to central France, and it was busy with traffic year-round. The plague followed the traffic. Avignon, where the papal court had been resident since 1309, in what was known as the Avignon Papacy, or, less charitably, the Babylonian captivity of the Church, was struck in January 1348. The situation in Avignon gives us some of the most vivid contemporary accounts of the plague in France, partly because the papal court attracted chroniclers, and partly because one of those chroniclers was Petrarch, perhaps the greatest Italian poet of his age, who was in Avignon at the time and whose letters describe the horror with the anguish of a man watching the world he loves being destroyed. Petrarch lost his beloved Laura, the woman who had inspired some of the greatest love poetry of the medieval period, to the plague in April of 1348. He wrote letters to his friends describing the devastation with an intensity that is not merely literary. He is genuinely grief-stricken, genuinely bewildered, genuinely struggling to find a framework within which what he is seeing makes any sense. Will posterity believe this, he writes? Will they believe that a time came when, with no armies, no natural disasters, no floods, the world was so empty of people that almost no one remained? The papal physician, Guy de Chauliac, stayed in Avignon throughout the epidemic and left a medical account of what he observed that is one of the most valuable documents of the period. He describes two distinct phases of the epidemic in Avignon. In the first phase, lasting about 2 months, people died within 5 days with swellings in the groin and armpit. In the second phase, which followed and lasted for 3 months, people were spitting blood and dying within 2 or 3 days. He is describing, with reasonable clinical accuracy, the succession of bubonic and pneumonic phases of the outbreak. He notes that he himself contracted the disease with a bubo in his groin, and that he was convinced he would die, and that he survived only because he allowed the bubo to be lanced. He is one of the relatively few people in this story who encounters the plague directly, and lives to tell about it in detail. The Pope, Clement VI, survived the plague in Avignon partly by following advice that, given what we now know about disease transmission, turned out to be accidentally effective. He sat between 2 large fires in his private chambers, essentially quarantining himself in warmth. The fires may have killed the fleas, or it may simply have been that the Pope was isolated enough from the general population that he had fewer flea-bearing opportunities than ordinary people. Either way, he lived, and from the relative safety of his chambers, he issued orders that would matter. He consecrated the Rhône River so that bodies could be thrown into it without creating unconsecrated burials, the churchyards having filled beyond capacity. He issued papal bulls that we will discuss in other chapters. He survived to deal with the aftermath. From Avignon, the plague moved up the Rhône into central France toward Paris. By the summer of 1348, it was moving through southern France broadly. By the autumn, it was approaching Paris. The French chronicler Jean de Venette, an Augustinian friar, describes the situation in Paris with the same mixture of precise observation and genuine horror that we find in Boccaccio and Petrarch. He notes that in some places not 10 people in 100 remained alive. He describes the fields going untended because the farmers were dead. He describes the livestock wandering loose because their owners were gone. Paris was struck in the summer of 1348. The city was, by medieval standards, enormous, with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, and the plague killed a large fraction of them. The Hôtel Dieu, the great hospital of Paris that sat on the Ile de la Cite adjacent to Notre Dame, was overwhelmed. The nuns who staffed it, in an act of selfless dedication that we should not pass over without acknowledgement, stayed at their post throughout the epidemic, caring for the sick, and died in enormous numbers as a result. Their devotion was real, and their deaths were real. In a story full of abandonment and flight, the nuns of the Hôtel Dieu stand as a reminder that not everyone ran. Into Spain, the plague entered the Iberian Peninsula through both the Mediterranean coast and the Atlantic coast. The Aragonese kingdom in the east was struck in early 1348. The kingdoms of Castile and Portugal fell victim through the year. King Alfonso V of Castile died of the plague in March of 1350, making him one of the few monarchs to die directly of the disease. His death during the siege of Gibraltar was a significant military and political disruption in the ongoing Reconquista, the Christian kingdom's centuries-long effort to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish rule. Even wars had to pause for the plague. England. The plague arrived on English shores in the summer of 1348, probably first at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, though some sources suggest it may have arrived at Bristol or other southern ports around the same time. England was, from the perspective of the plague, a slightly different proposition from the densely urbanized Italian city-states. It was less urbanized, more rural, with a population of perhaps 4 to 5 million scattered across a largely agricultural landscape. But this did not protect it. The plague moved through England with the same efficiency it had shown in Italy and France, following the roads, the rivers, and the network of market towns that connected English rural life. London was struck by the autumn of 1348. Contemporary records from London's churchyards and from the administrative records of various institutions show mortality on a staggering scale. The churchyard at East Smithfield, which served as a mass burial ground during the plague, has been partially excavated by archaeologists in modern times, and the results confirmed what the documentary record suggested: thousands of bodies buried in layers in a relatively small area. The chronicler Henry Knighton, an Augustinian canon, describes the aftermath of the plague in England with a vividness that makes clear he's not exaggerating for literary effect. He describes villages emptied of inhabitants. He describes harvests rotting in the fields because there was no one left to bring them in. He describes sheep wandering the countryside with no one to tend them. He describes a country transformed almost overnight from a functioning agricultural society into something resembling a landscape from a bad dream. Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were all struck. Scotland, which had initially viewed the devastation of England with something approaching satisfaction, its armies launching raids into the plague-weakened border country, soon found itself in the grip of the same catastrophe. The Irish chronicler John Glynn, a Franciscan friar, kept records of the plague in Ireland until very near its end, when his entries stopped. The last entry in his chronicle notes that he is leaving some parchment to continue the work, in case any human being survives, or anyone of the race of Adam escapes this pestilence and wishes to continue what he has begun. Below that entry, in a different hand, 2 words: "Here the author died." It is one of the most affecting moments in the documentary record of the Black Death. A man writing until death took the pen from his hand. Scandinavia. The plague reached Norway probably by ship, a vessel arriving in Bergen in 1349, reportedly with its entire crew dead aboard. From Bergen, it spread through Norway with the same devastating speed it had shown elsewhere. King Magnus II of Sweden issued a letter describing the plague that sounds remarkably like modern advice to isolate, urging his subjects to avoid unnecessary contact with others, to fast on Fridays, and to pray. The advice reflects both genuine pastoral concern and a complete misunderstanding of how the disease was transmitted. It was not, unfortunately, very effective. The Holy Roman Empire, the sprawling political entity that covered roughly modern Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic, along with parts of neighbouring territories, experienced the plague in waves through 1348, 49, and 50. The Rhine Valley, one of Europe's great commercial arteries, was a particularly efficient transmission route. Town after town along the Rhine fell to the disease. The mortality in some areas of the Holy Roman Empire appears to have been among the highest in Europe, with some towns and villages losing half or more of their populations, and then east, into Poland, into Hungary, into the territories of the Baltic states. The plague's advance was slower in Eastern Europe. partly because the region was less densely populated and trade routes were less intense. Poland, in particular, appears to have had somewhat lower mortality than the western regions, possibly because of geographic factors and sparser population distribution, though it was by no means spared. Russia was struck in the early 1350s, with Pskov and Novgorod recording devastating outbreaks. By 1353, when the initial wave of the pandemic had more or less burned through the accessible European population, the map of devastation was essentially complete. There was almost no corner of Europe that had not been touched. The only significant exception was certain isolated communities, mountain villages, remote islands, places sufficiently cut off from the trade and travel networks that the plague could not easily reach them. These exceptions are interesting because they demonstrate in negative relief that the disease spread along human connections. Cut the connections and you might be spared. Which is in essence the logic behind quarantine, a concept that the most sophisticated cities in Italy were already beginning to develop, however crudely, as the plague raged. The scale of the death across Europe is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Modern estimates, drawing on demographic analysis of tax records, church records, and other surviving documentation, typically place the total mortality at somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's pre-plague population. The most commonly cited figure is around a third, though some researchers argue for higher figures in the most severely affected regions. To translate that into raw numbers, Europe's population in 1347 was perhaps 75 million people. By 1350, it may have been closer to 50 million. 25 million dead in 3 years, though the deaths continued in successive waves after that. 25 million in 3 years. From a single pathogen that medieval science could not identify, that medieval medicine could not treat, and that medieval society had no institutional framework to contain. It is, by any measure, one of the greatest human catastrophes in recorded history, and we have not yet talked about what it felt like to live through it. Daily life inside the plague. What it felt like to live through it. The numbers are important. The geography is important. The biology is important. But all of that can be rendered abstract, turned into data that we process at an intellectual distance from what it actually meant to be a human being alive in Europe in the years 1348, 49, 50. So let us try, for a chapter, to close that distance. Let us try to imagine what it felt like. You live in a city. Let us say you live in a mid-sized English town, perhaps something like Shrewsbury or Gloucester, with a few thousand inhabitants. You've been hearing rumours for weeks, maybe months, of a terrible sickness in the south of Europe, in Italy and France. The rumours are vague and alarming in equal measure. Some travellers have passed through with stories. A merchant arriving from the continent described what he saw in a southern French port with a pallor on his face that suggested he was not exaggerating. But England is an island. Surely such things cannot cross the water. Surely God will protect you. And then one day in the autumn of 1348, a neighbour falls ill. Nothing unusual in itself. People get sick all the time. You ask after them. You're told they have a fever, nothing to worry about. The next morning someone mentions, with the lowered voice of someone sharing genuinely bad news, that the neighbour has a swelling. A hard lump, terribly painful in the groin. You feel a cold finger of recognition because you have heard this described in those travellers' stories. You know what this means, or at least you think you do. Within the week the neighbour is dead. And then someone else in the neighbourhood shows the same symptoms, and then someone else. And the doctor, if your town is fortunate enough to have one, visits the second case and contracts the disease, and is dead within days. And you realise, with the sick falling sensation that must have accompanied this realisation across tens of thousands of communities, simultaneously across Europe, that it is here, the thing you had been told about, the thing you had hoped would not come. It is here, in your street, in your town, and there is nothing you can do about it. What do you do? The first instinct for many people, if they had the means, was to leave. Run. Get away from the infected area. Go somewhere the plague had not yet reached. This was the impulse Boccaccio described in Florence. This was what the Pope's court in Avignon considered, and what the Pope counselled against. It was what wealthy families across Europe did when they could, retreating to country estates or isolated manor houses, hoping that distance would save them. Sometimes it did. More often they took the plague with them, or they arrived at their destination only to find the plague had got there first. For those who could not leave, who had no country estate, no wealthy relatives in an unaffected region, no means of transport, no savings to fund a journey, and that was most people. For those people, the experience of the plague was endured in place, in the town, in the street, in the house. And the texture of that endurance was shaped by a combination of genuine courage, absolute fear, physical exhaustion, and profound psychological disruption. The smell was, by all accounts, overwhelming. Plague deaths produced a distinctive odour, from the buboes as they suppurated and from the broader systemic breakdown of the body. Contemporary accounts mention it repeatedly. The smell of plague, they say, was recognisable. You could smell a plague house from outside. You could smell a plague ward from the door. The streets of a seriously affected city smelled of death, in a way that was qualitatively different from the ordinary smells of medieval urban life, which were already, by modern standards, significant. Bonfires were lit in some towns in an attempt to purify the air, based on the miasma theory of disease. The bonfires burned day and night in some cities, adding smoke to the already terrible mix of odours. The sound of the plague was also distinct. The tolling of church bells was constant in many cities. Bells were rung for funerals. A single funeral might warrant a brief toll. When dozens or hundreds of people were dying every day, the bells rang constantly. All day. A steady percussion of death that people trying to conduct the business of ordinary life had as their constant backdrop. In some cities the bells were eventually silenced, not as a form of denial, but because the toll on the morale of the surviving population was considered too severe. The silence that followed was, in its own way, worse. The mechanics of burial became one of the most pressing practical problems of the plague era. Normal medieval burial involved the church at every stage. The dying person received last rites. The administration of the sacraments that the church taught were necessary for the soul's safe passage. The body was then prepared, wrapped in cloth or placed in a simple wooden coffin, and interred in consecrated ground, ideally with a priest present to say the appropriate prayers. The location of burial mattered. Being buried in consecrated ground, close to a church, was spiritually significant in a way that was not metaphorical to medieval Catholics. It was about the literal fate of the soul. The plague made all of this impossible to sustain. Priests died in massive numbers because the duties of their office required them to be close to the dying and the dead, which put them at maximum exposure. Some priests refused to administer last rites to plague victims, terrified for their own lives. Others went to the sick without hesitation and died for their selflessness. As the epidemic progressed and the dead piled up faster than they could be processed, normal burial rites simply collapsed. Bodies were collected by carts, in some cities specially commissioned plague carts that went through the streets, while their operators called out to bring out the dead and were taken to mass graves. The mass graves were not individual plots. They were trenches, long ditches, in which bodies were laid in rows and covered with a thin layer of quicklime and soil before the next layer of bodies was placed. The workers who collected the dead from the streets and houses were, in some cities, drawn from the most desperate elements of society. People who had nothing to lose, or who calculated that the pay was worth the risk. The pay was indeed high. Everything was getting more expensive in the context of labour scarcity, even the most terrible labour. Some chroniclers describe criminals released from prison to perform plague duty. Others describe groups of men, unidentified, going from house to house collecting the dead with a matter-of-fact efficiency that the chroniclers found both impressive and deeply disturbing. Medical practitioners were in an impossible position. They had training certainly rooted in the classical medical traditions of Hippocrates and Galen, filtered through Arabic medicine, systematized in the university faculties of Salerno and Bologna and Paris. But none of that training had prepared them for this. The standard tools of medieval medicine, phlebotomy or bloodletting, herbal remedies, dietary advice, examination of urine, were not going to stop Yersinia pestis. Some physicians went to the bedsides of the sick and died. Others remained at a distance and offered advice through closed doors. A few, finding that normal medicine was useless, experimented. The lancing of buboes, which some physicians practiced, was one of the few interventions that occasionally helped by releasing the infectious material and reducing the pressure, though it was just as likely to spread infection further. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of the daily experience of the plague, beyond the immediate physical horror, was what it did to human relationships. The bonds of obligation and care that normally held medieval society together, the duty of children to parents, of parents to children, of master to servant, of neighbour to neighbour, of priest to parishioner, of doctor to patient. All of these were strained and in many cases broken by the terror of contagion. Boccaccio's account of fathers abandoning children, children abandoning parents, is supported by other sources. The chronicler of Siena, who buried his children with his own hands, could find no one to help him. The nuns of Paris who stayed at their posts are remarkable, partly because so many others in similar roles did not. People were terrified, and their terror made them selfish in ways that they must have found, in their better moments, deeply troubling. Medieval Catholic morality was very clear about the duty of care owed to the sick. It was a fundamental Christian obligation. To abandon the sick was, in spiritual terms, deeply sinful, and yet people did it, again and again, because the alternative was to risk dying beside them. The psychological aftermath for survivors must have been profound. We have relatively little direct evidence for the psychological states of plague survivors, because the concept of psychological trauma as a medical category did not exist in the 14th century. But reading between the lines of the chronicle evidence, you can see it. The flat, matter-of-fact tone in which chroniclers describe atrocities that should not be possible to describe calmly. The recurring theme of numbness, of the impossibility of grief when there is simply too much to grieve. Agnolo di Tura's line about how no one wept, because everyone expected to die. The widespread sense, recorded in sources from across Europe, that the normal rules of human existence had been suspended, that the world was ending. In many communities, the practical effect of this psychological disruption was a temporary collapse of normal social order. Looting of abandoned properties occurred. Debts went unpaid. Agreements were broken. Some communities experienced a kind of wild, desperate joy-seeking. People who believed they were going to die regardless deciding to eat, drink, and be merry in whatever time remained to them. This is documented in enough sources that it seems to reflect a genuine social phenomenon, not just the exaggeration of disproving chroniclers. If you believe you are going to die regardless, the calculation about how to spend your remaining time changes considerably. And then, slowly, agonizingly, in most communities the wave would pass. The dying would slow. The survivors would emerge, blinking from whatever shelter they had found, and look around at a world that was physically still mostly there, the buildings standing, the fields outside the walls still planted, the livestock still wandering, but was populated by a fraction of the people who had been there when the plague arrived. Neighbours gone, family members gone, the parish priest gone, the lord of the manor gone, half the town gone in a matter of months. What do you do with that? How do you even begin to rebuild a life in a world that has been so thoroughly unmade? The answers that medieval Europeans arrived at, the ways they tried to make meaning and restore order, are some of the most fascinating and sometimes most disturbing stories in the plague's long aftermath. The Church in Crisis. When God seemed to have abandoned Europe, there is a question that hangs over the entire Black Death, a question that haunted the people living through it and has continued to interest historians ever since. Where was God? This is not a question I am asking rhetorically or dismissively. For the people of medieval Europe, it was a genuine, urgent, terrifying question, because their entire understanding of the world was built on the premise that God existed, that God was good, and that God's world, however imperfect and fallen, was governed by a moral order. Bad things happened to bad people, good things happened to good people, or at least that was the general principle, even if individual cases required careful theological explanation. And when bad things happened on a sufficiently large scale, the accepted interpretation was that God was punishing humanity for its sins. Plague, like famine and war, was in this theological framework a form of divine chastisement. The problem with applying this framework to the Black Death was its sheer indiscriminate scale. Disease respects no moral hierarchy. Saints die alongside sinners. Children die alongside the corrupt. Priests die alongside murderers. The buboes appeared on the virtuous and the wicked with exactly the same frequency, and the pious died just as fast as the impious. If the Black Death was divine punishment, it was punishment so comprehensive, so apparently random in its targeting, that it was very difficult to find a morally coherent explanation for it. The Church's immediate institutional response to the plague was a mixture of genuine pastoral effort and practical crisis management. Pope Clement VI in Avignon took several significant actions. He commissioned a report on the plague from the Paris medical faculty, demonstrating a serious engagement with the question of its cause. He consecrated the Rhône River so that those who could not receive proper burial might at least rest in ground that had received a form of consecration. He issued papal bulls attempting to protect Jewish communities, which we will discuss shortly. He is also reported to have sat between two large fires for much of the epidemic, on the advice of his physicians, which turned out to be accidentally sensible in terms of flea avoidance, even if it was medically rationalized in terms of miasma and astrological theory. But the Church's deeper problem was institutional, not just theological. The plague killed clergy in enormous numbers. This was partly because the clerical role demanded proximity to the sick and the dying. Hearing confession, administering last rites, burying the dead, all of these duties brought priests and monks and nuns into close contact with infected people. The result was mortality among the clergy that may have equalled or exceeded that in the general population. In some dioceses, records show that more than half the priests died. Some monasteries lost all or nearly all their monks. The institutional infrastructure of the Church, its abbeys and priories and parish churches, its schools and hospitals, all were hollowed out. The response to this crisis was to ordain replacements quickly, sometimes without the normal period of training and assessment. Men who had not completed the usual theological education were rushed into holy orders to fill empty parishes. Women who had been nuns but survived were expected to take on roles previously occupied by those who had died. The result, inevitably, was a certain dilution of clerical quality, at least by the standards the Church itself held. Critics of the Church in the decades after the plague pointed to this, arguing that the hasty ordinations had filled the Church with inadequately trained, spiritually dubious clergy. Whether or not that characterization was entirely fair, it reflects a genuine concern about the institutional damage the plague had done. And then there were the flagellants. The Brethren of the Cross, or the flagellants as they became known, were a movement that had existed in various forms before the plague but exploded in scale and intensity in the plague years. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds or even thousands, would travel from town to town performing public rituals of self-mortification. They would march in procession, 2 by 2, stripped to the waist, whipping themselves with leather straps tipped with metal studs or points until the blood ran down their backs. They chanted penitential hymns, they attracted enormous crowds, and they offered, or seemed to offer, an answer to the theological question of where God was. God was here, in the suffering, in the penance, in the attempt to match human suffering to the suffering of Christ on the cross. The flagellant movement was deeply troubling to church authorities for several reasons. It operated outside normal ecclesiastical structures, without the supervision of bishops or priests. It implied that ordinary people could achieve grace and forgiveness through self-inflicted suffering without the mediation of the Church, which was dangerously close to heresy. It attracted people who were clearly in states of extreme psychological distress, and who were not always saying things that lined up with orthodox theology, and it was spreading rapidly. The movement moved through the Holy Roman Empire, through France, through the Low Countries, drawing followers with a magnetic intensity that reflected the depth of the desperation people felt. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellants in a papal bull of October 1349, and secular authorities in many regions eventually suppressed them, often by force. But the flagellant movement is significant not just as a historical curiosity. It is evidence of something important about what the plague did to the relationship between ordinary Europeans and their Church. It showed that people were seeking spiritual responses to the catastrophe that the institutional Church was not fully providing, that the traditional frameworks were not for many people adequate to the scale of what they were experiencing, that the desperation was driving people toward more extreme forms of religious expression. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The flagellants were not heretics in the technical theological sense. They were not, most of them, rejecting Christianity. They were expressing Christianity in a more extreme, more immediate, more visceral form than the normal parish liturgy provided. They were people who needed to feel that they were doing something, anything, to address the incomprehensible horror around them. The Church offered prayers, masses, processions, the intercession of saints. The flagellants offered blood, their own blood, as a direct offering, a physical statement of desperate faith. The Church emerged from the Black Death damaged, not destroyed, but damaged. Its institutional capacity was reduced by clergy mortality. Its theological authority was challenged by the unanswerable question of divine justice in the face of such universal suffering. Its grip on the cultural and intellectual life of Europe, while still formidable, was loosened. The seeds of the crises that would eventually produce the Protestant Reformation were not planted solely by the Black Death, but the plague watered them. A generation that had watched the church prove inadequate to the greatest catastrophe in living memory was a generation slightly less inclined to accept its authority uncritically. The church would survive, it would rebuild, it would remain the dominant institution of European life for another century and a half before Luther nailed his theses to the door in Wittenberg. But something had changed. The certainty, the unquestioned authority, the sense that the church had answers to everything, all of that was fractured in small ways in 1,000 communities across Europe that had watched their priests die alongside their parishioners, that had buried their dead in mass graves without the proper rites, that had asked where God was and heard nothing but the tolling of bells. The scapegoating of Jews, one of history's darkest chapters. The human impulse to assign blame during a catastrophe is powerful and understandable, even when, especially when, it leads somewhere terrible. When something kills tens of millions of people, and no one understands why, and the authorities cannot stop it, and God does not appear to be intervening, and the sense of helplessness is absolute, people look for an explanation that restores some feeling of agency. If someone caused this, then perhaps someone can be made to stop it. If it is a crime, perhaps it can be punished. If there are villains, perhaps the world makes sense after all. In medieval Europe, the answer that a large part of the population arrived at was the Jews. The accusation was straightforward, as such accusations always are. The Jews, people said, had poisoned the wells. They had deliberately contaminated the water supplies of Christian communities with a plague poison, either created by themselves or obtained from Muslim agents. This was the explanation. This was the villain. This was the crime. And the response in dozens of communities across Europe, particularly across the Holy Roman Empire, was massacre. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the position of Jewish communities in medieval Europe. Jews had lived in Europe for centuries, often under conditions of precarious tolerance at best. They were excluded from most guilds and most forms of agriculture. They were permitted, and in many cases specifically directed, to engage in money lending, which Christian canon law restricted for Christians. This made them economically useful and socially resented simultaneously. They lived in distinct quarters, ghettos before that word existed, subject to specific laws and restrictions, required in many regions to wear identifying clothing or badges, excluded from political participation, subject to periodic discriminatory legislation from both church and secular authorities. They were, in other words, already outsiders, already designated as different, as other, as not fully part of the Christian community. And in a crisis that required a scapegoat, outsiders are always the most available candidates. The specific accusation of well poisoning was not invented during the Black Death. It had been used before in various forms in various contexts, but the plague gave it a horrifying new urgency and scale. After all, something was killing people, something systematic, something that moved through communities with terrible efficiency. To medieval people who had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of germ theory, no awareness of the flea rat transmission cycle, the pattern of the plague's spread, moving through a city, jumping to the next, apparently concentrated in certain areas at certain times, must have looked, if you were primed to see it that way, like evidence of deliberate poisoning. The wells were the obvious target. Everyone used the wells. The allegations began in the south of France in 1348. Jews, it was said, had been seen near wells at night. Confessions were extracted under torture. Confessions that were, of course, false, but that confirmed the accusation in the minds of those who wanted to believe it. From these initial allegations, the accusation spread through France and into the Holy Roman Empire, and where the accusations went, violence followed. The massacres began in earnest in 1348 and accelerated through 1349. In Strasbourg, in February of 1349, the Jewish community of the city was gathered in their cemetery and burned alive. Approximately 2,000 people. The mayor of Strasbourg had tried to protect them and was removed from office for doing so. In Frankfurt, in July of 1349, the Jewish community was massacred. In Mainz, in August, the Jewish community fought back briefly before being overwhelmed. Several thousand people killed. In Cologne, the Jewish community was offered the choice of baptism or death. Most chose death rather than conversion. In Nuremberg, in December of 1349, the Jewish community was massacred and their synagogue demolished. The violence was not universal. Some cities and some lords protected their Jewish populations. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV issued some protective orders, though these were inconsistently enforced. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 explicitly condemning the persecution of Jews, pointing out, with reasonable theological logic, that Jews were dying of the plague just as Christians were, which undermined the accusation that they were responsible for it. Some bishops and secular rulers used these papal pronouncements to justify protection. But in too many places, protection was either not offered or not sufficient. The scale of the destruction of Jewish communities in the Holy Roman Empire during the plague years was catastrophic. Some scholars estimate that more than 300 Jewish communities were destroyed, either by massacre or by expulsion that amounted to a death sentence. Many communities that had existed for centuries, in some cases for over 1,000 years, were simply wiped out. People were killed, synagogues were burned, Torah scrolls were destroyed, cemeteries were desecrated. And in many cases, the property of the murdered or expelled Jews was seized by the local authorities, or simply looted by the mob, which was, it must be said, often a significant material incentive for the perpetrators. There is something particularly awful about the fact that, as the papal bulls noted, Jews were dying of the plague at approximately the same rate as their Christian neighbours. The accusation was not just false. It was obviously false to anyone who looked at the evidence available to them. But the function of a scapegoat is not to provide an accurate explanation. It is to provide a target, and the massacre of Jews during the Black Death was not primarily about the plague at all. It was the plague providing an occasion, an excuse, a new form of justification for violence and theft that drew on centuries of accumulated prejudice and discrimination. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death left wounds in the history of European Jewish communities that took generations to heal, if they healed at all. Many communities that had been destroyed in the German lands were slowly rebuilt in later decades as survivors returned or new settlers arrived. But the memory of the massacres remained. The pattern of accusation, of scapegoating, of violence that the plague had expressed so horribly did not disappear. It went underground, available to be activated again the next time a crisis required a convenient villain. The Black Death's persecution of Jewish communities stands as one of the darkest chapters in a story that is full of dark chapters. It demonstrates, with horrible clarity, what happens when a society in crisis is looking for someone to blame and has already designated certain people as outsiders. The disease was indiscriminate, the violence was not. Medicine, mystery, and miasma. How medieval doctors tried to understand the plague. In October of 1348, King Philip VI of France sent a request to the medical faculty of the University of Paris. The faculty was the premier medical institution of the medieval French world, and the king wanted answers. What was causing this disease? How could it be stopped? The faculty deliberated and in the following year produced a formal report. It is one of the most interesting documents of the Black Death period, not because it is right, but because of how thoroughly, how systematically, how confidently it is wrong. The Paris medical faculty concluded that the Black Death was caused primarily by a major conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars that had occurred in Aquarius on the 20th of March, 1345. This celestial configuration, the faculty explained, had caused a corruption of the surrounding air and water, releasing a miasma, a poisonous fog, that entered the body through the pores and lungs and caused disease. The triple conjunction of planets, particularly the inclusion of Saturn, which medieval astrology associated with death and dissolution, was especially bad. The warm, moist spring weather had exacerbated the effects. The faculty further advised that the eating of poultry, waterfowl, pigs, beef, fish and olive oil should be avoided, that baths should be eschewed because they opened the pores to the miasma, that people should build fires of aromatic woods to purify the air around them. I want to be fair to the Paris medical faculty here, because I think it is easy to mock medieval medicine from the comfortable vantage point of germ theory and antibiotics. These were not stupid men. They were the best educated medical minds of their age. They were working within a theoretical framework, Galenic humoral medicine combined with Aristotelian natural philosophy, that had been the dominant system of medical thought in Europe for over 1,000 years, and that had genuine explanatory power for many diseases and conditions. The miasma theory of disease was not crazy. It was wrong, but it was not irrational. The observation that disease clustered in areas with bad smells, near marshes and dung heaps and refuse, had led generations of physicians to conclude that bad air caused disease. The conclusion was wrong, but the observation was not. What the faculty lacked, and could not have had without the foundational conceptual shift that would not come until Pasteur and Koch in the 19th century, was any idea that disease was caused by living organisms too small to see. The entire category of the microbial was simply not available to medieval thought. Without microscopes, without germ theory, without any framework for understanding how a pathogen could be transmitted from one person to another, through invisible biological agents, medieval medicine was trying to solve a problem it could not even correctly formulate. The result was treatments that range from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was standard treatment for almost everything in medieval medicine, based on the humoral theory that disease was caused by imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Draining blood was supposed to restore balance. In plague patients, it drained people who were already compromised and likely hastened death. Various herbal remedies were prescribed, some of which had genuine antimicrobial properties. Thyme and various other herbs do contain compounds with some antibacterial activity, though nowhere near sufficient to combat Yersinia pestis. Poultices of onions and herbs were applied to the buboes. Bleeding was performed from the veins closest to the swellings. The lancing of buboes is the one treatment that might have occasionally helped, as we mentioned earlier. Some physicians lanced the swellings with lancets and drained them, applying hot plasters afterward. The rationale was humoral to release the corrupt matter, but the effect was sometimes beneficial in that it reduced the pressure of the infected lymph node and may have partially drained the infectious material. Patients who survived long enough for their buboes to spontaneously rupture and drain also had somewhat better survival rates than those who died before this happened. So the intervention was at least aligned with a genuine physiological phenomenon. The debate about what caused the Black Death produced a remarkable literature in the period. Medical treatises on plague multiplied across Europe, each physician offering their analysis and their recommendations. The Italian physician Gentile da Foligno, who died of the plague himself in June 1348, wrote a concilium on the plague that circulated widely. John of Burgundy wrote an influential treatment. The Catalan physician Jacome d'Agremont wrote one of the earliest plague treatises, completed in April 1348, just as the disease was arriving in his region. These texts vary considerably in their quality and their reasoning. Some are more empirically grounded than others. Some show genuine, careful observation of cases, but all of them are working within the same fundamental misconception, that the disease is a corruption of the air or of the humours, rather than a biological agent transmitted through specific physical channels, and none of them have anything to offer that can actually stop the plague. Guy de Chauliac, the papal physician we mentioned in the context of Avignon, is perhaps the most interesting medical figure of the Black Death era. He survived the plague himself, having contracted it with a bubo in his groin. He admitted in his chronicle that he lanced the bubo and applied a hot plaster to it, and that he was fortunate to survive. He was honest about the inadequacy of medical knowledge in the face of the disease. He described himself as afraid to die but ashamed to show fear. He was, by the standards of his time, an exceptionally good clinician, and even he could not do much beyond observe carefully and describe accurately. What is perhaps most significant about the medical response to the Black Death is not what the physicians understood about the disease, but what the most observant of them noticed about its behaviour. In Venice, authorities observed that the disease seemed to spread through contact with the infected or their possessions. This observation led, in 1348, to the appointment of 3 public health officers to oversee the disposal of the dead and the handling of infected goods. This is one of the earliest examples of organised public health response in European history. By 1377, the city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik on the Adriatic coast, instituted the first formal quarantine. Ships arriving from plague-affected areas were required to anchor offshore for 30 days before their crews and passengers were allowed to disembark. This period was later extended to 40 days in some ports, which gave us the word quarantine itself, from the Italian quarantina meaning 40. The quarantine of Ragusa was not based on a correct understanding of disease transmission, but it was based on a correct empirical observation that disease spread through contact and that isolation seemed to reduce it. The logic was sound even if the mechanism was not understood. These early public health measures, quarantine, isolation of the sick, regulation of burials, cleaning of streets, were the beginnings of something genuinely important. They were the first institutional acknowledgement that disease was a public problem requiring public solutions, not merely a private matter of individual sin and divine punishment. They were, in the most embryonic form, the first steps toward modern public health. It would take centuries more, and the development of germ theory in the 19th century to build the full edifice. But the Black Death, by forcing European society to confront the total inadequacy of existing responses, created the conditions for these new approaches. Medieval medicine failed the people of the 14th century completely, as it was bound to do given the state of knowledge. But out of that failure came, slowly, over generations, a new approach to disease. The physicians who survived the Black Death and tried to understand it were not fools. They were the ancestors, intellectual if not biological, of the scientists who would eventually unravel what had killed their predecessors and develop the tools to stop it. The plague returns, second and third waves. If you thought the Black Death was a single event, a catastrophe that struck in 1347 to 1353 and then mercifully departed, allowing Europe to begin rebuilding, you would be wrong. That would be too simple, too merciful, too convenient. The plague did not leave. It became endemic. It established itself in European rat populations, lurking in the rodent reservoirs that now existed in urban and rural environments throughout the continent, periodically erupting into human populations with devastating results. The first return, what historians sometimes call the Second Plague Pandemic or the Plague of 1361, struck England in the summer of that year. It was known at the time as the Children's Plague, the Mortalité des Enfants, because it appeared to kill children with particular efficiency. This is actually a significant observation that makes epidemiological sense. The initial outbreak of the Black Death in 1347 to 1350 had killed many adults, who died without passing on whatever degree of immunity their survival might have conferred to their children. The children born after the initial outbreak had never been exposed to the plague and had no prior immunity. They were therefore maximally vulnerable to the second wave. The result was a plague that, while probably not quite as universally deadly as the first wave, killed children in horrifying numbers. The 1400s saw repeated returns. 1369 saw another significant wave across Europe. 1374 to 1379 saw outbreaks of varying severity in different regions. The plague was becoming, in a grim sense, a recurring feature of European life, something that appeared with the same regularity as famine and war, something that people began to structure their social and institutional lives around, at least in part. The Italian cities, which had suffered first and most severely, also developed the most sophisticated responses. Venice and Ragusa, as we mentioned, pioneered quarantine. Milan, under the leadership of the Visconti family, developed a system of isolating the sick in dedicated plague hospitals called lazarettos, named after the biblical Lazarus. The first purpose-built lazaretto was constructed on an island near Venice in 1423. These were places where the sick could be isolated from the healthy, cared for with some degree of organisation, and where those who recovered could complete their quarantine before being allowed to return to the city. The 1400s also saw the development of plague regulations in many European cities. Specific rules about what to do when plague was suspected, who had authority to act, what measures should be taken. These regulations were imperfect and inconsistently enforced, but they represented a genuine attempt to institutionalize the response to a recurring threat. Cities learned, over decades of repeated outbreaks, that certain measures, quarantine, isolation, control of movement, cleaning of streets, regulation of burials, seemed to reduce mortality even if the mechanism was not understood. The repeated experience of plague was turning European cities into, very slowly and very painfully, somewhat more effective public health systems. The psychological impact of the plague's persistence deserves emphasis. The first outbreak, however catastrophic, could at least be experienced as exceptional, as something outside the normal boundaries of human experience, a singular event. But when the plague returned in 1361, and again in 1369, and again in the 1400s, when it became clear that this was not going to be a once-in-a-lifetime catastrophe, but a recurring feature of existence, the psychological adjustment required was of a different order entirely. People in the second half of the 14th century and throughout the 15th century grew up knowing that the plague might return, that the quiet of a plague-free year was not a permanent state but a remission, that the mortality that had carried off half the previous generation might come back for them or their children. This knowledge, this constant background awareness of the possibility of mass death, shaped everything. How people thought about the future, how they made investments and plans, how they approached relationships, how they thought about time and mortality. In some ways, the culture of the late 14th and 15th centuries is a culture shaped by this persistent awareness of death. The danse macabre, The art of the period, the literature, the religious practices, all bear the marks of a society that has had to find a way to live alongside the constant possibility of sudden, unpredictable mass mortality. We will explore this in detail in the chapter on culture. For now, just note that the repeated returns of the plague were as important as the initial outbreak in shaping the long-term legacy of the Black Death. The plague as an active epidemic force in Europe lasted in various forms until the late 17th century. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was the same Yersinia pestis that had arrived in Messina in 1347, still circulating in European rodent populations, still capable of erupting into lethal human outbreaks under the right conditions. The Great Plague of Marseille in 1720 was another significant outbreak. It took advances in sanitation, urban design, and eventually germ theory to finally break the cycle in Europe, though plague still exists in rodent populations in various parts of the world today and still causes human cases, though now treatable with antibiotics. The story of the Black Death, then, is not a story with a clean ending. It is a story that trails off into decades of recurring crisis, gradually diminishing in scale as European societies developed better responses, as the most susceptible rodent populations died off or developed resistance, as urban sanitation slowly improved, as the disease settled into a lower-level endemicity that was terrible, but not existential in the way the first wave had been. But the memory of the first wave never left. The first wave was the crucible. Everything that came after was lived in the shadow of what had happened between 1347 and 1353. The world turned upside down, social and economic upheaval. One of the strange things about catastrophe is that it can create opportunities as well as destruction, and that some of those opportunities, emerging from the worst of circumstances, end up changing the world in ways that the catastrophe itself did not intend. The Black Death killed, conservatively, a third of Europe's population. That is an almost incomprehensible tragedy. But it also, and I want to say this carefully because I am not trying to make the suffering seem worthwhile, it also created conditions that produced some of the most significant social and economic changes of the medieval period. It turned the world upside down, and some of what came out of the turning was, in the long run, better than what had been there before. The most immediate and most economically significant consequence of the mass mortality was a massive labour shortage. Medieval Europe was, before the plague, in many regions a genuinely overpopulated society relative to its agricultural capacity. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had been partly a consequence of this overpopulation, the land simply unable to support the number of people living on it. Peasants had virtually no bargaining power. They could be paid almost nothing for their labour because there were always more peasants available to take the place of any who complained. Land was more valuable than labour. This was the economic foundation of the feudal order. The plague reversed this, overnight, catastrophically. When a third or more of the population is dead, the ratio of land to labour completely inverts. Suddenly there are not enough people to work the land. Fields that had been intensively cultivated for centuries are abandoned because there are not enough hands to tend them. Lords who had previously paid their serfs nothing now face the prospect of their estates falling into ruin because they cannot find workers. The economic power shifts dramatically, from those who own land to those who provide labour, and the surviving peasants knew it. Within months of the initial mortality, wages in England were rising. Labourers who had previously accepted whatever they were offered began demanding more. Craftsmen raised their prices. Agricultural workers, suddenly scarce, could shop for the best terms available from competing landlords. The feudal assumption that peasants would stay in their village, attached to the land, bound by centuries of custom, was undermined as people began moving in search of better opportunities. The English crown responded in 1349 with the Ordinance of Labourers, and then in 1351 with the Statute of Labourers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of workers. Similar legislation appeared in France, in Castile, in other kingdoms. The logic was explicit. The pre-plague economic order should be maintained. Wages should not rise because employers could not afford it. Workers should stay where they were. The old rules should apply. The problem with the Statute of Labourers was that it was trying to legislate against economics. When labour is genuinely scarce, you cannot prevent wages from rising through legislation alone. Enforcement was sporadic and often ineffective. Landlords who needed workers competed for them anyway, offering wages above the legal limits because the alternative was an unworked estate. The legislation was resented bitterly by the working population, who saw it as an attempt by the wealthy to claw back the only advantage they had ever had. This resentment was one of the contributing factors to the great popular uprisings of the latter half of the 14th century. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the most dramatic expression, led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical priest John Ball, whose famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" encapsulates the egalitarian fury of the moment. The Peasants' Revolt brought thousands of people from the counties of Essex and Kent into London. They burned John of Gaunt's magnificent Savoy Palace. They attacked the Tower of London. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, the removal of certain unpopular ministers, and an end to the poll taxes that had been levied to fund the French wars. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, largely through the combination of treachery and force, and Wat Tyler was killed at a meeting with the teenage king Richard II. The specific demands of the rebels were not immediately met, but the revolt was significant not because of what it achieved in the short term, but because of what it represented. It was the first large-scale popular uprising in English history. It demonstrated in unmistakable terms that the English peasantry was no longer willing to accept its pre-plague position of total powerlessness without protest. Something had changed in the social consciousness of the labouring classes, and that change can be traced directly to the demographic transformation of the Black Death. Similar uprisings occurred elsewhere. The Jacquerie in France in 1358, though it predated the Peasants' Revolt, was a violent peasant uprising that drew on similar grievances: the burden of taxation, the arrogance of the nobility, the sense that the old order was unjust, and that the plague's equalizing effect on mortality should be matched by an equalizing effect on social arrangements. The Italian city-states saw their own upheavals, the Ciompi revolt in Florence in 1378 being the most dramatic, when wool workers rose against the guild system that excluded them from political participation. These uprisings were not all directly caused by the plague. They drew on long-standing grievances and immediate political triggers that varied from place to place. But they were enabled by the plague, in the sense that the demographic transformation it created gave the labouring classes an economic leverage they had never previously possessed. You cannot have a peasants' revolt in a world where peasants are easily replaceable. The Black Death made peasants not easily replaceable, and the social consequences of that change took decades to fully unfold. Over the course of the late 14th and 15th centuries, serfdom gradually declined in Western Europe. It did not disappear overnight. The process was slow and uneven, varying enormously from region to region, but the trend was clear. The rigid feudal system of bound peasants, attached to the land, with virtually no rights or economic agency, was giving way to a more flexible system of free labour, wage earning and tenant farming. This was not a gift from the nobility, it was a concession wrested from economic necessity. The lords who gave up serfdom did so because they had to, not because they wanted to. The economic disruption went beyond the labour market. The massive mortality among the wealthy as well as the poor created an unprecedented transfer of property. Heirs who had not expected to inherit received estates. Younger children suddenly found themselves heirs to family fortunes they had not anticipated. People of relatively modest backgrounds found themselves suddenly wealthy. This disruption of the normal inheritance patterns was one of the mechanisms through which the plague contributed to social mobility. The plague also disrupted trade networks significantly in the short term, as we mentioned in the chapter on Italy. But in the longer term, the reduced population meant that per capita wealth actually increased in many regions. There were fewer people, but there was the same amount of land, the same herds of livestock, the same accumulated wealth, now distributed among fewer survivors. This is one of the darkest ironies of the Black Death. The people who survived it were, on average, materially somewhat better off than the people who had lived in the overcrowded, famine-prone Europe of the decades before. Better paid labour, more per capita wealth, disrupted inheritance patterns, the beginnings of social mobility, the weakening of feudal bonds. None of this made the Black Death good. None of this justifies or compensates for the millions of deaths. But it did produce a world that was, in some structural ways, more dynamic than the world that had preceded it. A world in which the old certainties about social hierarchy were less firmly settled. A world in which the question of what kind of society Europe should be was for the first time in a long time genuinely open. Art, literature, and the culture of death. There is a painting, or rather a cycle of paintings, in the Campo Santo cemetery of Pisa, created in the 1350s, that haunts me in a way that few medieval images do. It is called The Triumph of Death. and it depicts death as a figure on a black horse, sweeping through a landscape of courtly pleasures, harvesting the living with a scythe. Beautiful young people in fine clothes, picnicking, hunting, listening to music, are mowed down indiscriminately. The dead lie in piles at death's feet. Above the scene, angels and demons fight for the newly released souls, and in one corner of the painting a group of cripples and beggars call out for death to take them too. Their suffering so great that even death seems preferable. The painting is not subtle. It is not trying to be. It is trying to do what all great art tries to do, to articulate something true about the experience of being alive, and in 1350-something Pisa, the truth of the experience was this: death was everywhere. Death was indiscriminate. Death came without warning and without regard for wealth or beauty or virtue, and no one, absolutely no one, was safe. The Black Death transformed European art. This is not an overstatement. The art of the late 14th and 15th centuries is different, in fundamental ways, from the art of the period that preceded it, and that difference maps directly onto the experience of mass mortality. Before the Black Death, death in art was present, but somewhat abstract, somewhat distant, somewhat theologically processed. The dead in pre-plague art were usually saints and martyrs, specific people who had died for specific spiritually significant reasons. Death was a theological event, a passage between worlds, something that happened to individuals in ways that could be placed within a framework of meaning. The suffering was real but comprehensible, located within a system of divine order that gave it a purpose. After the Black Death, death in art became something different. It became universal, indiscriminate, and in a deeply significant way, democratic. The most powerful expression of this shift is the danse macabre, the dance of death, a visual and literary tradition that emerged in the second half of the 14th century and flourished throughout the 15th. In the danse macabre, death appears as a skeleton or a decaying corpse and dances with figures from every level of society: pope, emperor, king, bishop, knight, merchant, peasant, and infant. Each figure is shown as being led away by death regardless of their rank, wealth, age, or spiritual status. The message is explicit and unambiguous. Death comes for everyone. No one escapes. No station, no wealth, no piety provides immunity. The Danse Macabre was painted on the walls of churches and charnel houses across Europe. It was performed as theatrical pieces. It appeared in illuminated manuscripts. It was reproduced in woodcuts that, after the invention of printing, reached enormous audiences. It became one of the defining visual motifs of the late medieval period. And its message, this radical assertion that death makes all people equal, was not just artistic. It had social and theological implications. If the Pope and the peasant danced the same dance with the same skeleton, then the earthly hierarchy that placed one above the other was not, in any ultimate sense, what really mattered. The related tradition of memento mori, remember that you will die, the artistic convention of including skulls and hourglasses and decaying organic matter in paintings, to remind viewers of their mortality, also became more pervasive in the post-plague centuries. Portraits of wealthy individuals showed, alongside their fine clothes and their symbols of status, a skull on the desk or a watch in the hand, a visual insistence that all of this earthly success was temporary. These were not depressing images in the contemporary understanding. They were spiritually instructive. They were reminders to value what was genuinely important: the soul, virtue, faith, over what was transient. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, which we have already discussed as a historical source, deserves recognition here as the great literary monument of the Black Death era. Written between 1349 and 1353, it uses the plague as both a frame and a foil. The 10 storytellers who have retreated to their Florentine villa to escape the epidemic tell tales that are largely comic, often ribald, sometimes tender, full of human vitality and earthly pleasure. The contrast with the horror of the plague they have fled is entirely intentional. Boccaccio is making an argument about the resilience of human experience, about the persistence of love and laughter and desire even in the shadow of catastrophe. Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague and whose letters we have already quoted, found the experience transformative in a different way. His late work, his Triumphs, includes a triumph of death that addresses the plague explicitly, the figure of death sweeping through a world of human love and beauty. Petrarch is often credited with considerable justification as one of the founders of the Italian Renaissance. His emphasis on individual experience, on the beauty of the classical world, on the value of human achievement in the present life, rather than only in the afterlife. All of this is inflected by the experience of watching the world he loved being destroyed around him and trying to understand what remained worth valuing. This is, I think, one of the most counterintuitive aspects of the Black Death's cultural legacy. You might expect mass mortality on this scale to produce a culture of despair, nihilism, hopelessness, and there were certainly currents of that. But alongside the culture of death, there also emerged gradually a renewed interest in the value of earthly life. If death could come at any moment, if the future was uncertain, then the present had a value that perhaps it had not been granted sufficient credit for. The Decameron's celebration of human vitality in the face of death is one expression of this. The Renaissance's celebration of human achievement and earthly beauty is another, more developed expression of the same fundamental impulse. The plague also transformed music and theatre. Mystery plays, morality plays, theatrical representations of death and judgment proliferated in the second half of the 14th century. Music became more emotionally intense, more preoccupied with mortality and transcendence. The great polyphonic composers of the late 14th century were working in a world saturated with the awareness of death, and that awareness found its way into their compositions. And then there is the question of popular culture, the songs and stories and folk beliefs that are harder to document than formal art but just as significant. The plague generated a folklore of its own, stories about how the plague spread, about who was immune and why, about what could protect you, about what happened to the souls of those who died without proper burial. Much of this folklore was wrong in its factual claims, but it was not irrational as a human response to incomprehensible events. People needed stories to make sense of what was happening. They needed frameworks, however imperfect, to process the experience of living through something that had no precedent in their experience or their tradition. The culture of death that the Black Death produced was not, in the end, a culture of defeat. It was a culture of reckoning. A culture that looked death directly in the face, painted it on church walls, danced with it in theatrical performances, wrote about it with unflinching clarity, and insisted that even in its shadow, human experience was worth something. That love and laughter and beauty and intelligence and courage were not rendered meaningless by their transience. That they were, perhaps, more precious for being temporary. This is the culture the Black Death left behind. A culture marked by an awareness of mortality that never quite went away, that inflected European thought and art and literature for generations. The memento mori tradition lasted into the Renaissance and beyond. The danse macabre was still being produced in the 16th century. The emotional intensity of late medieval art, its preoccupation with suffering and transcendence, fed directly into the spiritual upheavals of the Reformation. The Black Death was a catastrophe. It was also one of the most powerful forcing functions in European cultural history, pushing art and thought and literature into territory they would not otherwise have explored, producing works of genuine greatness from the depths of genuine grief. The legacy of the Black Death. How one plague changed everything. We have travelled a long way, from the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe to the ports of Sicily and Genoa, through the burning cities of Italy and France, across the Channel to England and up into the cold of Scandinavia, through the pogroms and the flagellants and the mass graves and the desperate physicians and the broken church. We have followed the danse macabre through the charnel houses of Europe and listened to Boccaccio describe Florence dying around him. We have watched the world turn upside down as labour became scarce and peasants discovered they had leverage. And now we come to the question that in some ways is the biggest one of all. What does it mean? What did the Black Death actually do to the world? Not just to the generation that lived through it, but to the centuries that followed. What is the legacy of the event that historians have called, without excessive hyperbole, the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history? The first and most obvious legacy is demographic. Europe's population, which had been somewhere around 75 million on the eve of the plague, took roughly 150 years to recover to pre-plague levels. 150 years, 6 to 7 generations. The plague's mortality, combined with the recurring outbreaks through the late 14th and 15th centuries, meant that Europe was a significantly less populated continent than it had been until well into the 15th century. This demographic gap shaped everything. It shaped the economics of labour and land. It shaped the pace of agricultural development. It shaped the political calculations of kingdoms and empires. But the demographic recovery, when it finally came, happened into a somewhat different structural landscape than the one that had existed before. The feudal system that had organized European society was not dead by 1450, but it was significantly weaker than it had been in 1346. The loosening of feudal bonds, the rise of wage labor, the increased social mobility, the weakening of the guild system's monopoly in some areas, all of these changes, seeded by the plague's disruption of the labor market, had created a more fluid social structure. Not an equal one, not a just one, but a more dynamic one. One in which the question of who held power and on what basis was more open than it had been. The weakening of the Church's institutional authority is one of the most significant and contested legacies of the Black Death. The Church in 1350 was not the same institution it had been in 1346. Its clergy had been decimated. Its theological authority had been challenged by the seemingly unanswerable question of divine justice. Its institutional capacity to serve its flock had been compromised by mortality and by the hasty, sometimes inadequate ordinations that followed. The popular religious movements that emerged in the wake of the plague, the flagellants, various mystical and heterodox groups, reflected a search for spiritual meaning that the institutional Church was not fully satisfying. None of this destroyed the Church. The Church remained enormously powerful, institutionally and spiritually, throughout the 15th century and into the 16th. But the erosion of its monopoly on spiritual authority, the growth of popular lay spirituality, the spread of literacy, and with it the ability of more people to read Scripture directly, rather than receiving its interpretation only through clerical mediation, all of these trends were accelerated by the Black Death. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, he was firing a shot in a war that had been building for 150 years. The soil in which the Reformation took root had been prepared, among other forces, by the plague. The Black Death also contributed to the conditions that made the Renaissance possible. This is a complicated argument, and I want to state it carefully because it can be misunderstood. I'm not saying the Renaissance was caused by the plague. The Renaissance had many causes, including the recovery and retranslation of classical texts, the growth of Italian city-state wealth and patronage, the recovery of ancient Greek philosophy, and many other factors, but some of the conditions that enabled it were created or accelerated by the plague. The increased social mobility of the post-plague world created a new kind of wealthy patron class, people who had risen into prosperity through commercial success rather than inherited noble status, who valued art and learning partly as markers of their cultivated identity. The disruption of old hierarchies created space for new ideas. The demographic thinning of the institutional Church, paradoxically, left more room for the kind of secular intellectual inquiry that the Renaissance would celebrate. The humanist movement's emphasis on earthly human achievement, on the value of this life rather than only the next, can be read as, among other things, a long cultural response to the lesson the Black Death had taught about the radical contingency of existence. The development of public health institutions is one of the clearest and most direct legacies of the Black Death. The lazarettos of Venice and Milan, the quarantine regulations of Ragusa and other port cities, the appointment of public health boards in Italian city-states, all of these institutions were invented or significantly developed in direct response to the plague. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the more sophisticated Italian city-states had public health bureaucracies with real powers, the ability to impose quarantine, to close city gates, to regulate the handling of the sick and the dead, to record and track mortality. These were the ancestors of modern public health systems. The system of maritime quarantine that was developed first by Italian port cities eventually spread across Europe and eventually around the world. When we talk about quarantine today, we are using a concept and a practice that was invented in the ports of the medieval Mediterranean in direct response to the Black Death. When we talk about contact tracing and isolating the sick, we are using strategies that European cities were developing, empirically and imperfectly, in the second half of the 14th century. The Black Death also, in a way that is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of its legacies, changed how Europeans thought about time, about history, about the permanence of institutions. Before the plague, the medieval worldview tended to see the structures of society, the church, the feudal order, the patterns of daily life, as essentially permanent, as having been established in something like their present form by God and by long historical tradition, and as continuing in essentially that form until the end of days. The plague shattered this assumption. An institution, a city, a dynasty, a social order could be gone in a matter of months. Nothing was permanent, everything was contingent. This shift in temporal consciousness, the recognition of historical change as real and significant, is one of the foundations of historical consciousness itself, of the idea that the past was genuinely different from the present, and that understanding the past mattered for understanding the present. The Renaissance historians who began, for the first time, to periodize history, to talk about ancient, medieval, and modern, were working in the intellectual aftermath of a catastrophe that had made historical change viscerally, undeniably real to everyone who had lived through it. We are, in the end, the inheritors of the world the Black Death made. The public health systems that have, in the modern era, kept epidemic disease from killing at the scale it killed in the 14th century, the social mobility that allowed talent to rise regardless of birth, the weakened deference to institutional authority that made scientific inquiry possible, the historical consciousness that allows us to understand where we come from and why. All of these things have deep roots in the aftermath of the plague. None of this, I want to say again, is a justification. 25 million people died in 3 years. Children were orphaned, families were destroyed, communities that had existed for centuries were emptied. The suffering was real and enormous and should not be minimized or made to seem purposeful in retrospect. There was no purpose. There was only Yersinia pestis doing what it does, and human beings trying to survive, failing in enormous numbers, and eventually, slowly, painfully beginning to rebuild. What the survivors and their descendants built, though, was genuinely different from what had existed before. And understanding those differences, understanding how a catastrophe of sufficient magnitude can transform the structures of a civilization in ways that turn out, in the very long run, to be significant and sometimes even progressive, is part of what makes the Black Death worth studying, worth spending a long night on. The plague did not intend any of this. Yersinia pestis has no intentions. It is a bacterium. It does not care about the Renaissance or the Reformation or the development of public health. It does not care about the Danse Macabre or the Decameron or the Peasants' Revolt. It was simply doing what evolution had shaped it to do. But the world it found itself in had enough resilience, enough creativity, enough fundamental human stubbornness to survive it and to make something, however painful and however gradual, out of surviving it. The Black Death was, in every measurable sense, one of the worst things that has ever happened to European civilization. It was also one of the most transformative, and the civilization that emerged from it, battered and changed and permanently marked, was the civilization that would go on to produce the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution, and eventually, after many more catastrophes and many more recoveries, the modern world. We carry the plague with us in our institutions, our art, our philosophy, our approach to public health, our ways of thinking about time and history and mortality. We carry it without knowing it for the most part, but it is there, in the word quarantine, in the image of a skeleton dancing with a king, in the idea that a person's worth is not determined by their birth, in the insistence that human life has value, especially in the face of its fragility. The Black Death happened nearly 700 years ago. The fleas that carried it are dust. The rats that hosted it are dust. The people who lived through it are dust, most of them buried in the mass graves we have described, or in the churchyards where their bones have long since dissolved into the earth. But the world they made is still, in ways we do not always recognize, the world we live in. That is the legacy of the Black Death. That is why it matters. That is why, even now, even in the comfort of a late night spent listening to history, it is worth knowing. And so the story of the Black Death settles, slowly, into the quiet that follows every storm. The plague that arrived in Sicily in October of 1347 had, by the time it burned through the last pockets of European population in the early 1350s, left a continent transformed beyond recognition. The streets of Florence were emptier. The rolls of manorial accounts were full of entries reading simply, "died in the plague." The mass graves had been covered and new grass had grown over them, as it always does. The survivors had gone back to the fields and the workshops and the markets, because people are remarkable in their capacity to continue with the business of living even after catastrophe. But nothing was quite the same. The world before October 1347, with its assumptions of permanence, its certainties of hierarchy, its confidence in the Church's ability to mediate between humanity and the divine, its feudal structures of bound peasant and powerful lord, that world was gone. Not all at once, not completely. but gone in ways that would become clearer as the decades and then the centuries passed. In its place was something harder, sadder, more clear-eyed about the radical contingency of existence. A culture marked by its awareness of death, yes, but also marked by a fierce, tenacious, sometimes ferocious insistence on the value of life. Boccaccio's young Florentines telling their tales in a villa above a dying city are the emblem of that insistence. They could have fallen silent. They could have lost themselves in grief. Instead, they told stories. They laughed. They celebrated the remarkable, ridiculous, beautiful, flawed reality of human existence, even as death rang its bells in the city below. That too is a legacy of the Black Death. The stubborn insistence on continuing, on rebuilding, on making art and music and literature and institutions in the ruins of what came before, on treating the world as worth inhabiting, even though the world had just demonstrated conclusively that it could destroy everything you built with terrifying efficiency and no warning whatsoever. I find that insistence genuinely moving. I think you should too. Now let the story settle around you. Let the names and the numbers and the dates soften into something quieter. Let the faces of the past, Giovanni Boccaccio in his villa, Petrarch writing letters about a world he barely recognised, Guy de Chauliac sitting between his fires in Avignon, the nuns of the Hôtel Dieu at their impossible posts, John Clyn writing until the pen fell from his hand. Let them fade gently into the dark, with the respect they deserve. Outside, the night is quiet. The world is, for all its troubles, still here. Still full of people building things, telling stories, trying to understand where they came from and what it means. Still, in the most fundamental sense, carrying on. That is not nothing. 700 years on from the worst thing that ever happened to it, Europe carried on. And so, in whatever quiet corner of the world you are listening from tonight, can you? Let your eyes close, let your breath slow, let the quiet hold you. The plague is history. The night is here. Sleep well. Good evening, and thank you for spending this time with me. If you are still awake, I both admire your stamina and gently suggest that the bubonic plague has done its work on your evening, which was, admittedly, the point. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, a subscription and a like are genuinely appreciated, and I will see you next time for another long night in history.